My grandfather's will said his fortune would go to the grandson who could solve his murder, and I knew who did it. I was sitting in that stuffy law office when the attorney read out the most bizarre will I'd ever heard. My grandfather had left his entire fortune to whichever grandson could prove who murdered him. The thing is, everyone thought he died naturally in his sleep. But I knew better because I'd been there that night, and I saw exactly what happened. Let me back up a bit. My grandfather was this eccentric old man who made his money in real estate back in the 70s. He owned half the buildings in downtown, and everyone knew he was loaded. The family always joked about who would inherit what when he passed. There were 5 grandsons total, and we all had our own reasons for needing that money. The night he died, I was crashing at his place because I'd gotten into another fight with my roommate about rent. I was broke, had been for months, and Grandpa always let me stay in his guest room when things got rough. That particular evening, I couldn't sleep because of this weird noise coming from downstairs. It sounded like someone was moving furniture around, which was strange because Grandpa always went to bed at 9 sharp. I crept down the stairs, trying not to make them creak, and peered around the corner into his study. What I saw made my blood run cold. My cousin was standing over Grandpa's desk, rifling through papers with a flashlight. Grandpa was sitting in his chair, but something was wrong. His head was tilted back at an unnatural angle, and he wasn't moving at all. My cousin looked up suddenly, and our eyes met across the dark room. Neither of us moved for what felt like an eternity. Then he slowly raised his finger to his lips in a shushing motion. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst out of my chest. I backed away slowly and went upstairs, but I couldn't shake what I'd seen. The next morning, the housekeeper found Grandpa dead in his study chair. The family doctor said it looked like a heart attack, probably brought on by his age and all the stress from his recent business dealings. Everyone seemed to accept this explanation, but I knew better. I'd seen my cousin there that night, and Grandpa had been dead when I looked into that room. For weeks after the funeral, I wrestled with what to do. Part of me wanted to go to the police, but I had no proof beyond what I'd witnessed. Plus, my cousin had always been the golden child of the family. He had this successful career, a perfect marriage, and everyone looked up to him. Who would believe me over him, especially given my recent string of bad luck and money problems? Then came the reading of the will and everything changed. The attorney explained that Grandpa had been suspicious about his own safety in the weeks before his death. He'd apparently been receiving threatening letters from someone trying to buy his properties, and he'd become paranoid about his family's true intentions. So he'd crafted this elaborate test to see which grandson would seek justice for his death. The rules were simple but terrifying. We had 30 days to present our case to a panel of 3 retired judges. Whoever could provide the most compelling evidence about the circumstances of Grandpa's death would inherit everything. If no one could prove murder, the money would go to charity. The stakes couldn't have been higher. As soon as we left the law office, my cousins started talking about hiring private investigators and forensics experts. They all seemed convinced that Grandpa had been murdered by some business rival or random criminal. But I knew the truth was much closer to home. The killer was standing right there among us, probably laughing inside at how clueless everyone was. I spent the next week doing my own investigation. I went through Grandpa's recent business records, looking for any connection to those threatening letters. I talked to his neighbors, his business associates, anyone who might have seen something unusual. But the more I dug, the more I realized that my cousin had been incredibly careful about covering his tracks. The breakthrough came when I was going through Grandpa's old photo albums. There was this picture from last Christmas where you could see my cousin's car in the background. It had this distinctive scratch along the passenger side from where he'd scraped it against a fence post. I remembered seeing that same scratch when I'd peered out the window that night, but I'd been so focused on what was happening inside that I hadn't processed it at the time. This gave me an idea. I drove to Grandpa's neighborhood and started asking the neighbors if they'd seen that specific car on the night he died. Most people didn't remember, but there was this one elderly woman who lived across the street. She was the type who spent her evenings watching through her curtains, keeping track of everyone's comings and goings. She told me she'd definitely seen my cousin's car parked outside that night, which was unusual because he rarely visited Grandpa after dark. She remembered thinking it was odd that he'd left his headlights on for so long, like he was planning to leave quickly. She'd even made a note of the time because she was watching her favorite late-night show. Armed with this information, I started piecing together what must have happened. My cousin had been in serious financial trouble, despite his outward appearance of success. I'd heard whispers at family gatherings about some bad investments and mounting debts. He'd probably gone to Grandpa that night to ask for money, and things had gone wrong. But here's where it gets complicated. The more I investigated, the more I realized that proving murder would be nearly impossible. There were no obvious signs of violence, no witnesses to the actual killing, and the body had been cremated before anyone thought to order an autopsy. All I had was circumstantial evidence and my own eyewitness account. The really twisted part was that my cousin had started acting friendly toward me since the will reading. He'd call me up, suggesting we work together to solve the mystery. He'd offer to share information and resources, all while playing the concerned family member who just wanted justice for Grandpa. It made my skin crawl knowing what I knew about him. 2 weeks into the investigation, something unexpected happened. I got a call from another cousin, one who'd been out of town when Grandpa died. He told me he'd been going through some old family documents and found something disturbing. Apparently, Grandpa had been planning to change his will anyway, and he'd been preparing to cut several grandsons out of his inheritance entirely. This news hit me like a punch to the gut. If Grandpa had been planning to disinherit people, then the motive for murder became even clearer. But it also meant that other family members might have known about his plans and had their own reasons for wanting him dead. Suddenly, I wasn't so sure about my cousin's guilt anymore. I decided to confront him directly. I showed up at his house one evening, uninvited, and found him in his garage working on his car. The same car with the distinctive scratch. We started talking about the investigation, and I mentioned that I'd been having trouble sleeping since Grandpa's death. I told him about the nightmares, about feeling like I'd witnessed something horrible but couldn't quite remember what. His reaction was subtle but telling. He got very still, very quiet, and his hands stopped moving on the car engine. He asked me what exactly I thought I might have seen, and there was this edge to his voice that I'd never heard before. It was like he was trying to gauge how much I actually knew versus how much I was just guessing about. I played dumb, pretending that my memories from that night were hazy and confused. I said I thought I'd heard noises downstairs, but had been too scared to investigate. I watched his face carefully as I spoke, and I could see the relief washing over him as he realized I wasn't going to be a threat to his secret. But then he said something that chilled me to the bone. He mentioned that it was a shame Grandpa had died alone, with no family around to comfort him in his final moments. The way he said it with this fake sadness in his voice made me realize just how cold and calculating he really was. He'd killed our grandfather and then played the grieving family member at the funeral. The next day, I made a decision that would change everything. Instead of going to the judges with my evidence, I decided to set a trap. I called my cousin and told him I'd found something important in Grandpa's papers. I said I'd discovered a hidden safe behind a painting in the study, and I needed his help to open it. I suggested we meet at Grandpa's house that evening to investigate together. The plan was risky, but I figured it was my only chance to get him to confess. I set up my phone to record our conversation, hidden where he wouldn't think to look for it. I also left a note for my roommate explaining where I was going and why, just in case things went wrong. When my cousin arrived at Grandpa's house that night, he seemed nervous but excited. He kept asking about what I'd found and whether I'd told anyone else about the safe. I led him into the study, the same room where I'd seen him that night weeks earlier. The atmosphere was thick with tension and unspoken secrets. I started by showing him the painting I'd mentioned, which was actually just a random piece of art on the wall. As he examined it looking for signs of a hidden safe, I began talking about that night. I said I'd been having more vivid dreams about hearing noises downstairs, and I wondered if maybe I'd actually gotten up to investigate. He froze completely when I said this. His back was to me, but I could see his shoulders tense up. He asked me what exactly I thought I might have seen, and his voice was barely above a whisper. That's when I knew I had him. I told him I remembered seeing someone in the study with Grandpa, someone who looked familiar but whose face I couldn't quite make out in the darkness. He turned around slowly, and the look in his eyes was something I'll never forget. It was like a mask had been removed, revealing the person he really was underneath. He didn't deny anything. Instead, he started explaining himself, as if he needed me to understand why he'd done what he did. He told me about the debts, about how his perfect life was actually falling apart behind the scenes. He'd made some terrible investment decisions and had been borrowing money from dangerous people. He'd gone to Grandpa that night to beg for help, but the old man had refused. Worse, Grandpa had threatened to tell the whole family about his financial problems. The actual killing had been almost accidental, he claimed. They'd gotten into an argument, and Grandpa had grabbed his chest, saying he was having chest pains. Instead of calling for help, my cousin had just stood there and watched him die. Then he'd staged the scene to make it look like Grandpa had passed away peacefully in his sleep. As he was telling me this, I realized just how dangerous my situation had become. He'd already killed once to protect his secrets, and now I was the only person who knew the truth. I started edging toward the door, but he must have noticed my movement because he suddenly grabbed my arm. That's when the real nightmare began. He told me that he couldn't let me leave with this knowledge, that too much was at stake. He'd worked too hard to cover up what happened, and he wasn't going to let anyone destroy his life now. I tried to reason with him, pointing out that the inheritance wasn't even guaranteed, but he'd become completely irrational. We struggled for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. He was stronger than me, but I was more desperate. I managed to break free and run for the front door, but he caught up with me in the hallway. That's when I heard the most beautiful sound in the world, police sirens approaching the house. It turned out that my roommate had gotten worried when I didn't come home and had called the police. He'd found the note I'd left explaining where I was going and why. The officers arrived just as my cousin was trying to drag me back into the house. When they found my phone with the recorded confession, the whole story came tumbling out. The trial was a media circus. Everyone wanted to know about the eccentric grandfather who'd created a murder mystery from beyond the grave. My cousin's perfect facade crumbled as more details emerged about his financial troubles and desperate state of mind. He was convicted of voluntary manslaughter and sentenced to 15 years in prison. But here's the twist that nobody saw coming, including me. When the judges reviewed my evidence and the recorded confession, they determined that I had indeed solved the murder as required by the will. However, they also ruled that since I'd used deception and potentially dangerous methods to obtain the confession, I'd violated the spirit of Grandpa's test. Instead of awarding the inheritance to me, they decided to split it among all the surviving grandsons, minus the one who'd committed the crime. It wasn't the outcome I'd expected, but it felt like justice in a way. Grandpa had wanted someone to seek the truth about his death, and that's exactly what had happened, even if the process had been messier than anyone anticipated. The money changed my life, obviously. I was able to pay off my debts, get a decent place to live, and start over. But the experience changed me in ways that had nothing to do with money. I'd seen what desperation could drive someone to do, and I'd learned that the people you trust most can sometimes be the most dangerous. I still think about that night sometimes, about what would have happened if I'd just called the police right away instead of trying to handle things myself. Part of me wonders if Grandpa somehow knew what would happen, if he designed his test specifically to expose the truth about his death. Maybe he'd seen something in my cousin that the rest of us had missed. The strangest part is that I don't feel like I won anything, despite inheriting a portion of Grandpa's fortune. The whole experience taught me that some secrets are too dangerous to keep, and some family members aren't who they pretend to be. I solved the murder, but I also learned that justice doesn't always feel like victory. Looking back, I realized that Grandpa's will was more than just a test of our detective skills. It was a test of our character, our willingness to seek truth even when it's uncomfortable. I may not have gotten the full inheritance, but I got something more valuable, the knowledge that I'd done the right thing even when it put me in danger. The whole experience made me understand that family isn't just about blood relations. It's about the people who stand by you when things get tough, who support you when you're trying to do the right thing. My cousin may have shared my DNA, but he was never really family in the way that mattered. These days, I try not to think too much about what happened. I've moved across the country, started fresh, and built a new life with the money Grandpa left behind. But sometimes, late at night, I still wonder about that moment when I saw my cousin in the study. What if I'd spoken up right then? What if I'd turned on the lights and confronted him immediately? Maybe things would have been different. Maybe Grandpa would still be alive, and maybe my cousin would have gotten the help he needed instead of spiraling into murder and deception. But I've learned that you can't change the past, only learn from it and try to make better choices going forward. The inheritance money is invested now, growing slowly but steadily. I've used some of it to start a small foundation that helps people with financial troubles before they reach the point of desperation. It's my way of honoring Grandpa's memory and making sure his death wasn't completely meaningless. I never visit my cousin in prison, and I probably never will. Some bridges are burned beyond repair, and some betrayals cut too deep to forgive. But I do think about him sometimes, wondering if he regrets what he did or if he still believes he was justified in his actions. The other cousins and I don't talk much anymore. The whole experience tore our family apart in ways that can't be repaired. Everyone knows the truth now, but that doesn't make family gatherings any less awkward. Some secrets are too big to ignore, even when you want to move on and forget. But I've found peace in my new life, in the quiet routine of ordinary days without murder mysteries or family drama. I've learned to appreciate the simple things. A good meal, a comfortable bed, the knowledge that the people around me are who they claim to be. After everything that happened, those simple pleasures feel like the greatest inheritance of all.